Hi, I am Jeffrey Warnick. Welcome to another pod shoot, and I'm very happy to have as my guest today. I have a conversation with Wes Henricksen. Uh, I, uh, I frequently look for interesting titles to read since I'm sort of a voracious reader, and I came across a suggestion, I don't recall where, of a book Wes has recently been written and published. It's called In Fraud We Trust: How Leaders in Politics, Business, and Media Profit from Lies. One would hope that a title like that would be an oxymoron rather than probably be a truthful and accurate statement. But it might be very sad as a society that that actually is the case, is that we do seem to trust in fraud and people profit off perpetu- perpetuating frauds. So, Wes, to start off this conversation, you can talk a little bit about your book. I also had read your article that you wrote several years ago on scientific knowledge fraud, which I found a very interesting read. As somebody who is in I'm a Bitcoiner, and part of being a Bitcoiner means that one of the attributes that you like about Bitcoin is that the ledger never lies. It's called, trustless technology. You have a protocol. Trust is embedded in the protocol. And because they do such a good job of embedding trust in a protocol, there's no need for the protocol itself replaces trusted third parties, and you have a ledger. That ledger is a real-time ledger. It never lies, and nobody ever disbelieves what is on that ledger. And so I wrote a paper several years ago called, the something like the most valuable currency. The trust is the most valuable currency. So trust should be the foundation. We say rule of law is the foundation for society, but I think really trust is the foundation for society, and rule of law should reinforce trust. And it seems that we now live in a world where there's very little trust. It's probably, given the fact that there seems to be so little credibility in any of the institutions, I would insist that it's a systemic problem, and so that we need to rethink the how we intermediate trust as a society. And I'm also a believer in I'd rather have the evolution of trust occur through common law and contracts, and not in DC through rules and regulations that will typically be influenced by those that have the most success at having influence. So, so with first talking about really kind of what my bias is, I'd like to get into you to discuss, what inspired you to write the book, and what do you hope will come out of the book, and people getting exposed to your thoughts, your ideas, and reading the books on how we could solve this problem that to me is a systemic problem.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I appreciate it very much that you were one of the few people to read Scientific Knowledge Fraud, because these are academic papers that we faculty members put out, not to be read by that many outside the academy. But I'm happy to hear that it actually found an audience, at least of one. And that article is part of kind of the journey that led me into the exploration that became In Fraud We Trust, the book, which was during 2015, 2016. I had been researching how the fossil fuel industry misled the public into doubting climate change, which is an old story by now. And this is an issue that, of course, has more than two sides to it. It's a complicated issue, and I understand that there's many dimensions. But I was really exploring just the way that the fossil fuel industry kind of shaped public opinion. And it's very fascinating to see how the public thought one way and then thought another. And the way that occurred was really through public relations and a very, very heavy media effort through the media to shift public opinion. And then once the 2016 election came to pass, there was a lot of talk in the media about fake news and misinformation and disinformation. And this became a buzz topic that people were talking about. And I saw, it seemed very obvious to me that the stuff I had been researching and looking into tied together with this misinformation, disinformation, fake news topic in a way that really nobody was talking about it at the time, which the bridge between the two is the concept of fraud. Now, nobody was really putting the two together. And so that kind of led to me undertaking the research and writing more papers and eventually coming out with this book, In Fraud We Trust, which puts forward the novel argument, I suppose, that I put forward in the book is that the laws that we have to protect us against fraud have up until now really only been focused on applying to frauds that occur in the one-on-one context almost exclusively, even though the way that fraud occurs has changed with this new communications technology, first with TV and radio in the early 1900s, and now with the digital world and social media. The way that fraud occurs has changed radically, and the way that fraud law works hasn't kept pace. And so what we have today is really a mismatch between the way fraud occurs in most circumstances and the biggest frauds and the laws that apply to it. So for the most part, fraud, what I call fraud on the public, is not really captured under the law for the most part, although there are some exceptions.
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing when you say fraud on the public, when we have, when we have sort of like, you could say like through the political process, there should be a check and balance in the system. So let's say, for example, if you have a president who defrauds the public, where it's easy to demonstrate that somebody said something that they probably didn't believe because it was expedient to say that, and they probably knew what they were saying was not truthful, yet because they say it and they get a bunch of people to repeat it, that a lot of people believe it. You could say that the remedy is, it should be, maybe, is that, that Congress could consider that a high crime and misdemeanor, and that the president could be, cited for impeachment, and the House could call it the president, whoever's in the office, and say, here are things that you said. Here are things you said one day. Here's the things you said another day that completely contradicted the things that you said. You're trying to influence policy through yourself directly and indirectly to influence policy by perpetrating lies, and you're doing this intentionally. And we don't think the founders intended that be a legitimate act of the presidency, and we're going to impeach you for doing so. But since all of Washington, since everybody runs for office basically doing the same thing, you're not going to condemn one person in DC for impeaching them on something that you likely are guilty of yourself. So you won't find that an impeachable offense, and maybe that's the reason why it's difficult for impeaching anyone, is because whatever you impeach, whatever reason, could come back to bite you in the ass. So I think as somebody who is an investor in free speech platforms, and unmoderated free speech platforms. So I don't believe in content moderation by a sole authority figure. If the user wants to moderate their feeds, giving rights for users to moderate their feeds, that's their choice, and that's giving them their own options, and they can choose their own values and preferences. But I never want to be choosing values and preferences for another person. And so once I start engaging in algorithms and manipulating who gets to see what, then basically I'm choosing my preferences over the choices that people freely make on their own. And, and I don't want to be in that business. Maybe Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg like being in that business because they want to have more influence and they want to have people aligned with them to have influence. But, I believe in a marketplace for ideas and an unfettered marketplace that is not tainted by any controlling authority trying to have any sort of manipulation or control of a narrative. Let the narrative be a function of a pure, clean market process where the platform is basically infrastructure. So I'm curious in your view of the world, what do you think is the responsibility for like platforms like BitChute? For me, I'd prefer that not BitChute be a police, which it will not be, but basically, the people who are on the platform, if they think that somebody is spreading misinformation, how it is that people can, how is it that we can have more of it embedded in people's reputations or basically application of laws on what kind of propaganda that should create a liability for the person who uses any sort of social media, and also should there be a responsibility for an algorithm that if somebody is promoting bullshit, okay, fraudulent content, and an algorithm is spreading that fraudulent content, so it's being seen now by more people than it would get organically. What responsibility should the platform have? If the platform becomes not only a place where you can freely express yourself, but that the platform will actually be a coactive partner in having more people see that content that might be, as you would define, fraudulent in nature.
So you raised a couple of really interesting points, and I'm going to answer obviously the question that you posed to me, which is specifically with regards to platforms and what maybe to do about that or how I see that. And then maybe later we'll circle back to the political speech topic, which you began speaking about. But you kind of went right to the heart of probably the most difficult question raised in my book, which is about political speech. Because I am a very strong free speech proponent, and I understand, being a constitutional law teacher and scholar, the importance of protecting free speech and not allowing law too heavily to weigh in on political speech, because political speech needs to be the highest protected speech, which it is. But when it comes to platforms, I think you asked me, what do I believe maybe the responsibility is of platforms, or what should be the responsibility of platforms. And I come at this not from an economist background. I wish I had an economist background like yourself. I highly respect economists and I love economics, but I don't have an economics background. And so I come at it from a legal background. And according to the Supreme Court, of course, a platform is a private speaker in the speech context. So they're a private enterprise, they're a private company. They have responsibilities to make money, I suppose, right? So as a private company, they're making money. So what is their responsibility to the public? I'm not sure what their responsibility to the public is. Ethically, of course, they should be responsible in our society for upholding free speech values. But to the extent that they're allowed to by law, I think their responsibility is to make money for their shareholders. That doesn't really have any free speech. I don't know where that leaves us. And so you have the Facebooks, the X's of the world, and they have algorithms, which is called content moderation, I suppose, by the courts. So they do content moderation. Do they need to reveal what those algorithms are, how they advantage some speech over others? I don't know. Is that a market issue? Do we just let the market decide? If users are willing to put up with the secrets, or just take the content as it comes and their feed as it comes, and have the certain speech elevated and certain speech not? Is that something users can decide? Can they? I guess they're free to leave the platform. At the same time, I understand, BitChute. I don't know that much about the platform, but I understand it stands for free speech and doesn't have the same influence over content that some of these other platforms are doing. And is that a better approach? I would argue it is, but I don't know if that's the platform's responsibility or if that's just a principled stand that the platform takes.
I think it's both. I think, going back to not the economics but the law. Ultimately what we get is not a consequence of what the common law system provided. It's a function of government regulation and the government doling out perks and privileges and benefits. And what am I referring to? I'm referring to the fact that initially when we started having the internet and there was hosted content, there was litigation with respect to when is a platform responsible for the content it hosts. And there were two cases. The first was like a CompuServe case where the courts basically ruled that if you function as a bulletin board, that basically a host of a platform, that a host that is basically a bulletin board, the host itself has no liability. If there was someone that had this other, I think it was like with respect to stock trading, I forget the name of the case, but basically it was somebody who said, I'm hosting content, and here are the rules of this, that I'm, as me as host, I'm imposing on the community who want to participate in this community, and by the way, I'm going to be checking to make sure that everybody's complying with those rules. And the courts ruled that given the fact that they did have rules, and given the fact that they were monitoring, and that created an expectation that they would have knowledge, therefore they were no longer a neutral platform, exempt from liability, but they would be liable for the content that was going up, because whatever was up, they were proving being up. And this was from the common law before Congress got involved. It seems Congress did not like that outcome, because the people that sponsored this, what's known as Section 230, that provided, immunity to platforms. They basically, the people who sponsored 230 did not say we want to protect free speech. They said we don't want free speech because it'll be the wild, wild west. And so we do want people to go and monitor and surveil. And we want to make sure that whatever actions they take of removing content that in their judgment is bad content, based upon whatever criteria they choose to employ, that we want to give them the confidence that they can make all these decisions and make sure that they have no platform immunity for doing it. So we might not have surveillance platforms if it wasn't for Section 230, because the act of surveillance now means that once you choose to surveil in the world without 230, it would mean that whatever you decide to keep on that platform, you now have liability for. So the behavior might be very different, and we might never have had platforms that scaled the way Facebook and Instagram and Twitter did in the early days, because what facilitated their scaling was the comfort level that they could surveil and still preserve platform immunity for whatever decisions that they made, as opposed to understanding that the consequences that the common law system would have provided on them is, once they created terms of service and once they decided to engage in surveilling and algorithmic intervention, that basically the consequence of that would be basically waiving, the immunity that the common law system had provided. So maybe we'd see a very different internet today. Maybe we would not see any big tech. Maybe we would just see a lot of, smaller platforms where people would be on platforms that, that they related to, identified with, rather than this huge scale platforms that have, the power that they have to, to do narrative control in a way that might have good effects, or bad effects. But we might see a likely very different market structure if there was no 230, and that 230 was not a consequence, again, of the common law system. It was the government intervention that created this privileged class of platform that had this unique immunity that did not come from a byproduct of how the law system would treat it, if there was no intervention by Congress in the process. So these were all congressional animals, so the question is, I like to think is is part of this problem a function of 230, is that we basically let a few platforms control a significant part of the narrative, and that the decisions that they make, that they can make, having no obligation of transparent, like the government didn't say, you're granted this immunity, but in return for granting this immunity, you'll have to disclose your algorithms. I mean, they just basically said, here's the immunity, apply it any way you want, and you'll be protected because we want there to be gatekeepers. So we want to encourage gatekeeping. So I don't know if this is the topic you've thought much about or at all about.
Well, I would say I've thought a little bit about this topic because the big topic that I'm addressing in the book is really the problem of leaders in politics, business, and media, as I say in the subtitle of the book, people that have access to the public megaphone that can push out messages that have an effect on millions of people. If that's done in bad faith and done in a fraudulent manner, then we need to kind of capture that under the fraud laws. How does that apply to platforms? Well, you've been discussing Section 230. So Section 230, if anyone is not that familiar with it, just broadly gives immunity to platforms online for content that's posted on those platforms by third parties. And so the platforms themselves are not going to be liable, generally speaking, for content posted on them by third parties, which now is kind of like the big way we get information. Or one of the biggest ways we get information is through these social media platforms, content's posted. But as you were kind of discussing there, it's not like these platforms are just passive platforms that just sit back and let people post content. They actively engage in the content and decide, first of all, what can stay on the platform and what can be tossed out, and which content to boost and what content to suppress, or maybe put warning labels on some of it saying this might be false or what have you. I mean, they do this content moderation. And so is Section 230 the problem? I don't know, but I think that platforms, this is not my idea. Others have said it, like the philosopher Yuval Noah Harari. He said algorithms, platforms should be liable for the actions of their algorithms. And I think that that's probably right. That would implicate, of course, that those algorithms would have to be disclosed to somebody. I don't know if that means that they need to be disclosed to the public at large, or if they just need, I guess, how would we know what the algorithms are liable for if we don't know what the algorithms are doing? So at some level, those algorithms would have to be disclosed. I don't know how much of that would have to be public. I'm not an expert in this area on algorithms at all, but I think that the platform should be liable for the actions of their algorithms and the results of that. But whether Section 230 at its core is a problem, meaning platforms should actually be liable for the third-party content put on their platforms, I'm not sure. That I'm much less persuaded by, because I think that the speaker is not the platform unless the algorithm's involved. The speaker's the third party posting content, and that's the liable person if there's some harm to come from that particular message.
Yeah, that's an interesting segmentation of really the application of 230. Should the application of 230, if a platform decides a specific content is harmful to the community and decides to remove that content, so in other words, some users, the platform was all user-generated content, and the platform is not manipulating the user-generated content itself, except it's deciding that certain content is according to the platform's definition, is harmful, and they don't want that content to appear on the platform. That's one application of the immunity. The other is basically, a whole bunch of people putting up content, and these platforms deciding that they want to control the narrative, so that they're using algorithms like Musk said, freedom of reach, but not freedom of speech. So how much is it user generated content if ultimately, Elon Musk is deciding, which of that content gets gets to be circulated, and including him amplifying, the content, and how much responsibility is, for that, where it's no longer really about, user generated content, but about you deciding the type of content that you want to be emphasized in the narrative that you want the platform, to have, and you're using algorithms, to basically to get a lot of people to input content, but the output of that content doesn't look like the input of the content, because ultimately you're changing the narrative by suppressing stuff and amplifying another. So, in that case, that maybe the court should distinguish between the two, and maybe there should be, and then the question is if your content is suppressed, how do you know it's suppressed if you don't have any publication of some sort of how algorithms manipulate the content? So you don't know when there might be liability to the platform or not liability, because you don't know how much of the narrative is controlled by the algorithm rather than controlled by the user.
So if I can just jump in for quickly 1 second, I think that any liability of platforms for content that they're moderating, as you say, let's say a platform removes a post. Given the case this summer, the case in particular of Moody v. NetChoice, so this was a Supreme Court case that came down. It didn't decide the issue, but it was dealing with laws in Florida and Texas. These are state laws that in their own distinct ways imposed requirements on platforms that were operating in those states, like Facebook, YouTube, what have you, either to balance political content or to provide explanations for every single action of when content was removed. Like they have to explain to the state authorities why a piece of content was removed. And the Supreme Court didn't decide the issue. This issue hasn't been decided. It was kicked back to the lower courts for further fact development, and they wanted the lower courts to basically build a stronger case on the fact side of how this regulation was actually going to apply to not only these large platforms, but to platforms in general. But in dicta, the Supreme Court made clear that to the extent these platforms are moderating content, they are going to be viewed by the Supreme Court as protected, as engaging in protected speech, because they're private, they're not government. So these are private platforms. And so if they're moderating content, they're expressing their own views to the world. They're not just serving as a passive third party through which the content moves. And so they're expressing their own views, which means to regulate these platforms on that level, if they're moderating content, is going to be a big uphill battle, because they're engaging in protected speech, and any regulation of that would have to pass strict scrutiny, which is a difficult hurdle to get over in the free speech context.
No, that I agree with. I was not very sympathetic to the remedies that Texas and Florida were trying to implement. One is, first, they were trying to give preferences actually to the political actors. So they wanted to make sure, the first thing they wanted to make sure is that people who ran for office could not get kicked off. So they were making a privileged class of user. It wasn't like the same benefits to everyone. They just somehow you have greater rights if you're running for office than if you're not running for office. I don't recall that being in the Constitution, that inalienable rights are different depending upon whether you're a candidate for office or not a candidate for office. So I was not sympathetic from that perspective. And from a practical perspective, we have something called, that's been pretty much been the case from corporate law, is the business judgment rule, is that basically we give companies flexibility to make decisions that they think are in their best interest, and you don't second guess every decision you made. If not every decision every company could make, they could be litigated by shareholders or third parties that feel they were adversely impacted by that decision, and have every private enterprise justify every decision they ever make on any topic, which would make it almost impossible to operate a business, if you get litigated over the best calls you make as a business person trying to, maximize the value, of your business. So, but why did they do that? They did it because they wanted to make sure that they themselves could not get kicked off these platforms, or have their content treated. So it was a very self-serving piece of legislation, and the remedies seem to be, pretty stupid. And I was disappointed that the courts did not make a stronger statement on how stupid the remedy was, and and the preferences that were embedded in this. So, but I guess I'm leading us more, this conversation more towards platforms than the topic of, how can we make, as a society, how can we change the incentives about people, committing acts of fraud that impair, society from making the most well-informed decisions. What laws do you think are not being applied, or what laws do you think? Like, I can tell you a couple of suggestions I've made, and again, I don't really like the law very much, but I would like a couple of things. I would like that every time anyone ran for office, every candidate would have to have a swear, an oath that basically, that would be comparable to you swearing an oath when you're testifying in court, so that basically if anyone, if you say anything in public that anybody can prove was a fraudulent statement, and you said it with malice because you wanted to either help yourself or hurt the other party. And so when you say something like that, the question is, if you're running for office and you're trying to, say stuff that that's harmful, that is not true, and that debases political speech. The question is if you have this oath that says you promise not to say it, and the burden would be that you could prove that you knew what you're saying was false and you had malicious intent, that the remedy would be that you would have to be remove yourself as candidate, and you never get to run for public office again. So so basically, maybe everyone who's once they become a candidate, there should be an obligation that they take an oath that as they run for office, they can't say anything that they know not to be truthful. So again, that's different from having an opinion. People can still express their opinions and qualify their statements as opinions, but a lot of times politicians state things as facts that are not really facts, that are, I mean, let's take right now, and I'm only doing it because he's now in office, but you had Trump run for office. Trump ran for office saying, tariffs will not cause inflation. And subsequent, now he said, well, I can't guarantee that they won't cause inflation. So the question is did he learn something along the way? Or did he run for office making a statement that many people believed that he knew was not true, and that he said it, and then maybe less people would have voted for him if he would have said, well, I'm going to impose these tariffs, that I think the trade-offs are acceptable, as opposed to him selling as if there were no trade-offs. So, so the question is could that be considered a fraud? I think in people running for office, yeah, I would hold them to a higher standard of speech, but maybe, it is just our responsibility that when people commit these things, these type of statements, that maybe it's our responsibility. And if they say things that they know are untrue, and they might even have malicious intent, that basically should they be subject to, a discipline process other than the voting process. So what do you think? How can we produce a lot of fraud? So the question is how can we change society, with that is permission, that still really views free speech as an inalienable right, but that doesn't mean that it protects against fraudulent speech.
Well, you raised several interesting issues, and I think that the last little part of our conversation segues well into this one with the case over the summer with the Florida and Texas laws, because that went to show, I think, how this is like a bipartisan issue in many ways, because you have efforts from the left, certainly, to police speech. We've seen that not so much in the government from the US, I don't think, except indirectly, although we did have this Biden disinformation governance board, which is just a terrible, terrible idea. And then on the right, you have these states that are trying to clamp down on platforms for their own political reasons. So there's this bipartisan issue, fraud in politics. I do have solutions. I don't think they're the final, the end all solutions to this problem, but I kind of have maybe a springboard, a starting point to finding solutions. On the political front, there are a number of states that have already passed false political speech laws, and these aren't even new. I mean, these have been coming down the pipes in state legislatures since the 1980s, and many of them have been struck down as violating the First Amendment. They haven't even all been challenged. Some of them are still in the books. So there are false political speech laws out there. How do we, zero in on the real problem here, as I see it, which is not just false speech, which is, I think, the wrong framing when we're talking about this, because we all engage in false speech. That's part of speech. We're wrong a lot of the time. We change our minds, what have you. So the problem isn't false speech, of course. The problem is bad faith, dishonesty, and profiting off of manipulating others to believing something to be false, or that you're reckless in spreading the idea with, not knowing whether it's true or false. The First Amendment, for very good reasons, of course, demands that we give a lot of leeway when it comes to political speech. So people have the right to be wrong. They have the right to be stupid. They have the right to be just spreading falsehoods, particularly if they believe them to be true. How far does that right extend? Well, it doesn't extend to fraud. Back in 1791, when the First Amendment was ratified, it was already understood that it didn't encompass fraud. And so fraud has always been one of the many carve-outs, one of the exceptions to the free speech clause of the First Amendment. So fraud is not protected, which is why I zero in on it. Right. And so what kind of speech crosses the line into fraud? Well, fraud has very clear elements, but let me try and simplify it. You're not just lying. You're lying for self-serving purposes in a way that causes some kind of harm. Now, the word harm, of course, is open to wide interpretation, and we have to be careful with that, because a lot of people claim speech is harm. It's like, okay, well, it probably needs to have some sort of causal connection with a tangible, real harm of some kind. Is stealing an election a harm? I don't know. So it might be in some contexts. But the example you raised, Jeffrey, of Trump saying tariffs won't cause inflation. Now, again, I'm not an economist. I'll keep relying on that caveat. I'm not an economist, and so I don't know anything about. I don't know about tariffs, and maybe the statement is patently false.
Let me say, one is him first saying it's not. One is to have an opinion to say I don't believe tariffs cause. But the question is, if one day as a candidate I say tariffs are a free lunch, and now that I win, I say tariffs are not a free lunch. So the question is, at the time I said tariffs are a free lunch, did I really believe it, or did I say it because that's what I wanted the people who, when they voted to polls, believe? Now that I'm in, I want to alter their expectations. So I knew what I was saying was false at the time. That's my point. It's when you say one thing one day as a candidate, and then now that you're in office, you say something that contradicts what you said as a candidate, because now you don't want to be responsible for the expectations of that you created as a candidate. So that would seem to indicate to me that that person probably knew that they were lying when they were candidate, and they're readjusting, if you can prove the case. I mean, you could sit back and say, tell me why you changed your mind. It's like if I'm a candidate and I say we're being invaded, okay? I think the official numbers are there are 11 million immigrants, but I believe there are 21 million immigrants illegal in this country, and you're scaring the shit out of people because it's an invasion, and maybe 11 million doesn't convince people it's an invasion, but 21 million does. Then the question is where did you come up with that 21 million number? You give a number, you throw it out there, and then the question is what's the source that you get that number? So is the source there that you have a reasonable explanation of where you came up with that number, or did you just make a number that was high to scare the shit out of people, to have the impact that you have, and ultimately would that be, considered a fraud? So I know in the business world, I do deals, I negotiate deals in the business world, and you have when you're speaking to third parties and you're speaking about things related to the business you're representing, you can't misrepresent, your assets or, your cash flows. You can't, then basically, because people are the expectation is that whatever you're saying, people should rely upon as being truthful. So, if I say I have, 3 million in the bank and I only have 50 cents in the bank, I know that I don't have 3 million in the bank, and so, there's certain things I should have knowledge of. And given what I should have knowledge of, I gotta create the same right expectational framework, because I'm inducing people to spend more money and do more due diligence, by telling them a phony story that subsequently, after they spend time and money, they will understand will be a phony story. So the question is, in politicians, why shouldn't politicians, be subject to that same standard of what's a fraudulent statement? What are they saying that someone could basically demonstrate that they know what they're saying is not true, and they're saying it because it's politically expedient. And if it was easier to, if politicians impeached each other for committing fraudulent statements, or citizens could sue politicians for statements that seem like, someone says that, there's where'd you get this 21 million number? And if you have a reasonable explanation, and saying it doesn't have to be a correct explanation, it just means this was not malicious intent. I all these sources gave all this information, I've read these papers, I came up with this. So if I made a number and I made a specific number, not thinking, one thing is saying I don't believe the official numbers, the other is coming up with your own number. And the question is to come up with a number, what did you do to come up with that number? And if there's a reasonable answer, then the case will probably go nowhere. And if there's not a reasonable answer, then the case will go somewhere. So maybe people would be a lot more careful about what they say, and we'll get a lot more honest discussion on issues, because we really get very little honest discussion about issues, because basically everything, when candidates run for office, everything is a free lunch. Okay, so you can't really believe that every candidate run for office actually believes that every decision has no adverse consequence and trade-offs don't exist. Okay, but that's what they say, trade-offs don't exist. Okay, I can do this and it's all only wonderful thing, there's only upside in it, there's no downside, it's all a free lunch. And then when they're in office, then they start making all the excuses about the trade-offs that exist, that they knew existed when they were running for office, but decided to appeal to low information voters who find it very appealing, the free lunch that politicians say. So,
oh yeah, I mean, the couple of examples that you gave and that discussion right there, it highlights in my mind the difficulty of trying to draw a line on political speech. And so it's easy to say, well, we won't allow fraud, whatever we define fraud to be. Well, we have to define fraud. And in a political context, is it enough to just say, well, knowingly false and causes what? I mean, all political speech causes some kind of democratic response to it, I suppose. Thereby, would patently false speech be thereby harmful by definition because it's done in a campaign and it's a harm to democracy or to the institution or to the election or to the voters? And it's really difficult. The two examples you gave are very different, I think. One is a prediction, and that's the tariffs are not going to cause inflation. I'm not an economist, but it sounds like that's an I believe type of statement because will not cause, that's a prediction. I mean, it's really hard to lie about a prediction or to prove someone's lying about a prediction.
But again, I qualified that by not saying if he would have said, this is what I believe tariffs are not inflationary, and left it there, then I'd say I agree with you. But if one day he says it is, and then he's in office, then he says it, then he says, well, it might cause inflation. Prices might not go down. When before I was guaranteeing prices went down. The question is did I learn something new along the way that I needed to qualify, or did I know when I was saying it? Did I know I was full of shit? I mean, so again, if he never made the subsequent statement, I agree with you. I don't want to hold anybody who says I'm engaging in this policy and this is what I think the impact of this policy will be, and that's just an opinion. And they might think tariffs don't cause inflation, and that's okay for somebody to believe that tariffs won't cause inflation. That's fine. But as soon as he was president, suddenly the president-elect, suddenly now it's changing the expectations that maybe prices won't come down, and he's now backing away from making a statement saying, that I can guarantee that these tariffs will not be inflation. Now he's saying, I don't really know. They might cause it. They might not cause it. So the question is, did he speak to somebody that he learned during this period of time, or did he know at the time he was just saying it because he knows the laws are so weak with respect to defining fraud that you might just say all these fraudulent statements that to be fraudulent statements because you can get away with them.
Yeah. On the other hand, the other hypothetical that you put forward was the idea of Trump or somebody else maybe claiming that there's an invasion, and they give a number of of immigrants or illegal immigrants or something along those lines.
Right.
That seems closer to something that might be provably false. And it brings to mind the 2020 stolen election idea. Not really an idea as much as an invention, but there's this invented idea that it was just that election was stolen. There were 5 million people voted in California or something like that, like illegally. There's a bunch of claims those are very easily falsifiable. I mean, you can say, well, did this person have any basis for saying it? Probably not. And that goes to kind of your example of this invasion of immigrants. I mean, those are numbers. So it's closer to, a balance statement. It's like there's numbers involved here. And so if someone claims 10 million, did they just pull that number out of somewhere, or was it reported? Of course, then if you have these, there's all kinds of false reports. And so could they blame it on some, tie it into something like that? I don't know. It's very difficult. But I guess the distinction it's not a solution to say it's very difficult. The problem is today, as you have pointed out, Jeffrey, there is just simply no guardrails at all. There's zero. So right. You can literally say anything. And so it's like, is that the best way to uphold our electoral system? Is that the best way to hold elections, to decide who the leaders are, is just to have it be a free-for-all? Just put just say anything and everything you want? Or should there be at least some guardrails so that, some of these statements are too false and too dishonest and too bad faith to cross the line? No matter what system we come up with in the political realm, especially, it's going to have a lot of leeway for being wrong and for saying things that aren't necessarily true. But is there a line to be drawn somewhere? Perhaps. But I think in the political realm, you've got to have limitations on, the false statement laws in politics, probably to pertain to particular areas of maybe the election itself, or some narrow issues, because false statements, obviously we don't want politicians to lie that much. At the same time, we all know that any freedom you give to prosecutors or to plaintiffs to sue for false speech can be abused as well. And so you have to narrow the claims on false speech to something narrow enough that it's going to at least cut down some of the line without giving a green light to political opponents to bury their opponents in litigation or prosecution for lying. It's a balance. And so that's why political speech is the most difficult one. That's a very difficult area.
I kind of disagree with you in the sense of one is I think that and it's something I try and do in practice is if you have an opinion, state that you're speculating, so people know you're speculating. If you're saying something as if you want people to take it as being a factually correct statement, or opinion based upon an informed opinion where you've done due diligence, then cite something. I believe this because here are my citations. So, and again, it's an opinion that you can prove where it's not you just saying it, where you're picking it, you're just saying it, as a consequence of fiat, that you have no evidence, people want to hear it, people will like hearing it, and so because you've done your polling data that says this is things that people like to hear, you want to help shape their beliefs, you want to appeal to their fears, and because you've gotten all this polling data that indicates what resonates with people, and so you decide to exploit that, and you exploit it knowing that at the end of the day the things that you say you don't really mean, and when you say them you don't mean them, and you know that they're false, but that you can, there's the concept of an efficient breach, that where the benefit of breaching exceeds, is so high that it's stupid to not breach. And maybe that's our system today. Our system today is, that politicians with the special immunities they have, and the statements they make and the representations they make on behalf of government, I, as a private business person, would not be able to represent my business in the same way they represent their responsibilities. If I behave like they did, I would be in jail or be paying, fines for a lot of money, for making statements, that clearly, I know, and I understand the difference between misinformation and disinformation, where somebody has an opinion that's just not well-formed opinion that they believe for whatever reason, and they tell people they believe it, and they believe it for whatever reason they believe it, as opposed to, somebody that knows something and spreading something that they know to be false. The question is really, do we want politicians that spread so much misinformation because they're just ignorant on everything, and they should be able to get away with being ignorant on anything, and they spread misinformation, not intending to spread disinformation because they're just not well informed, and yet they're spreading a lot of ideas without any information, having studied anything on these topics, and that maybe they should have the discipline of actually doing due diligence before opening their mouth. Don't we want to encourage politicians to be thoughtful? Do we want to? It seems to me we want to encourage them to be stupid and thoughtless. We seem to not want them to be, thoughtful, and having performed, rigorous due diligence before they say things. So they're careful about the statements they make because they know the impact and consequences their statements that they make have.
I don't disagree with anything you said. I too believe that we do need to somehow change the system in a way that enforces honesty, because now the system rewards the political system, the electoral system. It rewards dishonesty. So you really can't win being honest. I mean, it wouldn't even be possible. So you're forced into dishonesty from the get-go. That's bad for democracy on a number and for the country on a number of levels. And I mean, I go, of course, in the book, in Fraud We Trust, I explain how kind of we got to where we are, which is a long story. But really, then what we're left with today is in a digital world with massive information diffusion all the time, echo chambers, we're all silent in our own thing, and there's these reinforcement mechanisms where you reinforce what you already previously believe over and over and over, and there's no repercussion for dishonesty within that system. As you said, Jeffrey, there is repercussion for dishonesty in business. There's repercussion for dishonesty with your shareholders. There's repercussion for dishonesty in different spheres, but when it comes to politics, the only repercussion for dishonesty is success if you're successful at being dishonest. And so it's the system incentivizes dishonesty. And the only pushback I'm trying to give is I understand that and I disagree with it, and I think the system does need to be changed. It's just that how that change will occur, I don't have the exact language. I put forth, a fraud on the public, elements of fraud on the public kind of thing, but in the political realm, it has to be implemented very carefully because any punishment or prohibition can be abused. And so it has to be done in a way that's narrowly drawn in order to really get the worst of the dishonesty while not giving a green light for abuse is kind of what I'm getting at.
When we think about like the statement that you made is, it's the pendulum, back and forth swinging, and so we let's just say the abuse has gotten so extreme. If we want to make a decision, where do we want to be on that pendulum today? We might want to be too extreme on the other side, but that doesn't mean which trade-off do we find more acceptable as a society, with respect to do we want there to be impunity with respect to making fraud for politicians committing public frauds, and where do we find the balance of we don't want to be a nuisance so that every political opponent is basically forcing, and maybe there are other remedies, if you're a candidate and you challenge you accuse your opponent of committing a fraud and you don't prove it, that maybe the consequence will be you have to then step down as a candidate. So the question is, can you create incentives for it not to be abused? Loser pays, or again, if somebody is an opposing candidate, maybe the consequence of making frivolous claims, would be that they would have to drop out of the race and they would never run for public office again. I don't know if any of this is constitutional, so I don't know who would survive a constitutional challenge. So I'm just looking for ideas, so we can change the incentive structure so people behave differently, because the rewards for good behavior are higher, and the punishment for bad behavior is more certain. So and not too onerous. So at the end of the day, you're not being deprived of working and having a life. You just have to have a life outside of politics. You're not going to jail. You can still get a job if people want to hire you with that type of character. But and maybe people will. Who knows? But but at least the penalty doesn't screw somebody's life over. It just ends their political life.
I, yeah, and I think that that's one of the options on the table for narrowing this to limit it to not be so heavy-handed, let's say, from the government perspective. I think that sort of the guardrails that I'm proposing is the word is the idea of fraud to begin with. That's the whole narrowing right there, because one of the big problems with regulating political speech that we've seen in the last 5 years with Australia, for example, just passed, they didn't pass a law. They proposed a law, it didn't get passed, which was like a misinformation law. Okay, well, you have misinformation laws. The word misinformation cannot be tied in with like a law against speech in any way, because the category of speech is just too open to interpretation. And
I
so one
agree.
person's
This is about fraud. Yes, so we should
exactly.
it's
So
just
once you
about
narrow
fraud.
it to fraud, that's kind of everything that I'm getting at. It's like that's what we're trying to stop here. I think everyone would agree across the political spectrum that we do not want to accept fraud. I think that some of the bad faith dishonesty going on would cross the line into fraudulent speech. But being wrong is never going to be, that should never, it should never be illegal to be wrong, or to be wildly wrong, or, to say something false. That's fine. But when you're purposefully manipulating people for your own ends, that's fraudulent. So that's kind of the distinction. Again, I think it has to be carefully implemented. I know I'm repeating myself, but
And how about with respect to like businesses? You first started off with, the issues of, the scientific knowledge fraud and the propaganda campaigns that, that companies commit to basically in instance where you believe are demonstrable evidences of fraud.
well, the scientific knowledge fraud was mostly centered on the fossil fuel industry, but the tobacco industry is probably the most famous example of an industry that knowingly misled the public to profit off of it, financial profit off of it, while causing physical health harm to millions and millions of people. So the tobacco industry killed, but through tobacco use and secondhand smoke, over 100 million people before they paid any money in damages or settlement, which happened in 1998 for the first time. That's kind of an extraordinary number. And of course, their own knowledge of what they were doing wasn't necessarily as publicly known at the time, which makes it hard to hold them liable for it until it's after the fact, once you get discovery and get whistleblowers and get people from the outside to know. Fossil fuel industry, kind of a similar thing. These days, climate change has become an extraordinarily complex issue with exaggerations on both sides of it. But initially, it was a scientific question, and the industry essentially paid to have public opinion shift to doubt and make it a political thing. And of course, now it's a political issue, but it wasn't initially during the 1980s. And so how do we hold companies liable for that? Well, a similar approach is fraud on the public. I say we need to hold companies liable for fraud the same way we would when it's done one-on-one. Some industries have had some liability imposed on them. So you have the tobacco industry. They have paid settlements. They have had a few judgments against them. And after decades and decades and decades, you do have in some narrow cases courts calling what they did fraud. And so, yeah, they call it fraudulent, even though it was information disseminated to the public at large, and somebody out there is going to rely on it, and people are going to be harmed by that. And so you have kind of precedent from the tobacco industry of how to hold companies liable, hopefully in a shorter term horizon than 50 years after they were doing the activities. But there's been a number of industries that kind of have a similar playbook. Now, of course, there are laws against fraudulent advertising, anti-competition. There's different ways that false speech can impose liability on companies already now. But the problem is that defrauding the public at large just generally isn't viewed by courts as the same as one-on-one fraud, which is kind of where I see there's a loophole, I call it, or a paradox.
I agree. How about like the example of COVID and some of the response and statement made by government? How much is it possible that maybe the public was defrauded by Fauci or from people at the CDC or the WHO or maybe governors or the local politicians? So again, when people are doing the type of things that occurred as a society during during what we experienced at COVID, the question is, how much did we do because of people making claims that they really had no. One thing is to sit back and say is, I don't know what the hell is going on. And so we're going to take all these precautions, because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I don't know anything yet. We don't have enough information. And given the fact that we don't have enough information, we're taking these steps for these reasons, as opposed to now we have taken up that a lot of evidence seems to be that most of the steps that were taken have proven to be, not that really didn't save many lives, at all. And there might have been, and over time we might find that we destroyed more lives than we saved by what was determining. So instead of people just saying, I just don't know, and so why don't we consider doing this, or maybe we should defer to your own judgment because we don't have science yet and we can't make any scientific statement because we have no data and we're just guessing. Instead, there was, in my opinion, fake science, because there was no data. You need data. You have to have an application of a scientific method to say there's science. There was no application of the scientific method, so when you had to do the social distancing and the masking and all that type of stuff, at the end, the studies seem to indicate that none of that, was very helpful at all. Studies indicate that we didn't really need to shut down schools. We still don't know whether this was naturally occurring or came out of a lab. Yet people were called liars if they made a claim saying it came out of a lab, and they were called liars. And some people lost their job for saying something because some government official said, "Well, we don't want you to say that." Even though it might actually be true, we don't really know whether it's true or false. We know we don't want you saying it. So what do you think the application of fraud is for, what might have been, the greatest fraud perpetrated against the American public, which is, a year of response to COVID, where we accumulated, $5 trillion of incremental debt, and society locked down, and we've seen test scores for kids have not recovered in math and science. So we don't know what the permanent damage from all these policies would be. At what point would you consider this, potentially fraudulent, activity, as opposed to just poor judgment of people who were just maybe not the smartest in the world, making the best decisions they can with the best information, with no intention of misleading people, and trying to be transparent so people could have the same information that they had when they were making the policy recommendations that they were making.
So I'm going to give a very lawyerly response. Unfortunately, I'm a lawyer, law professor. Obviously, there's no way I could know what the intention of people were, and fraud really turns on intent. And so in order to be fraudulent, something isn't just wrong in hindsight. Well, now we know it was wrong. And was it done in bad faith? We don't know. Well, maybe. What was the intended gain to get from it? Well, there's probably political gain. There's probably lots of things to gain from it. But it's got to be knowingly false and really, to further one's own interests. And of course, when it comes to any particular real life example, it's got to go to court or something. It's got to, you got to have like discovery and witnesses and what have you. So I don't know if it was fraudulent or not, but I think it's a very difficult case, the whole COVID case. It's easy now to say they were wildly wrong. Let's say the authorities got it wrong, and they got it they got it wrong in a bad way, and they caused a ton of harm. It's harmed our kids more than anybody. It's harmed society, and the repercussions will go on for years. Fraudulent. It's a tough call. I mean, how much of the fear in early 2020, mid 2020, how much of that fear was manufactured by the authorities, and how much of it was human nature caused by the world of what was going on? It's a really difficult question. I mean, I think that the authorities maybe scared people into, on maybe at a level in hindsight that was dishonest, or at least wildly inaccurate and exaggerated. At the same time, it was a pandemic. I mean, people say, well, the pandemic was the fear. Well, it kind of runs together. I don't know. I just don't know. Maybe I should do more research on what the authorities knew and what they were telling the public, because fraud is essentially a disconnect between what you know or what you think and what you say. And so how big of a disconnect was it on, April 20th and then April 30th and then May 5th and whatever? Like, you march along, you say, this is what the message was. Mask mandates, school closures. I understand all that. And in hindsight, it's, states like mine, I'm in Florida, we were actually very fortunate that our restaurants stayed open for the most part. And I would have conversations. My agent is actually in Canada, and I was having a conversation with my agent, and he said, is it true what I'm seeing on TV? Like, in Florida, are you guys really like just going to restaurants? And I said, yeah, like everything is mostly, of course we had a little bit of shutdowns here and there, and schools were closed. But I mean, restaurants were open when they were closed in a lot of other places. And so Florida, of course, benefited from that. And so there's the 50 state experiment thing that is sometimes alluded to. So you have different states having different approaches to the same thing going on. But I'm just not enough of an expert on what Fauci knew and when he knew it, and what the administration knew and when they knew it, to label it with fraud. Although it's easy now to label it as wrong and overblown. Does that? I hope that's a satisfactory answer. I don't think I'm on the same page as you, but I'm not closed to it. I just don't know enough, I don't think.
Well, my concern is I'm not sure whether he committed a fraud or not. What I am fairly confident of, as an opinion, is the fact that he didn't have to concern himself with whether he was committing a fraud or not, because the expectation that he had that he could be charged with committing a fraud. Again, when you're in the private sector, you understand very well that when you speak with third parties and you create expectations, you have to be very careful about what you say, and that you can't create fraudulent expectations. So expectations management in the private sector is very, very important, because that if you mislead somebody, if you're clever about how you use language and words, to create a false image that it's a false image, and then somebody subsequently learns that it's a false image, and that you were just clever in your use of language to create a false picture, that ultimately, that you could be liable for fraud for doing so. So because you knew you were painting a false picture, and you were doing it because there was a benefit for doing it. So, and we don't really know what Fauci's benefit was from this, but the question is with all the information that he had, was he honest with the people? And to the extent that he was not completely honest and forthcoming and transparent, then what would be the reason he was not forthcoming and transparent? And and the question is, then we listen to that, and we can make a judgment on whether it's fraudulent behavior or not. But I don't think he's worried about I need to behave in a certain way, because if not, somebody's going to charge me with fraud, and would the behavior change if they knew that there was a possibility, and a reasonable possibility, that they are engaged in fraudulent behavior, and that they could be held liable for the fraudulent behavior. So the sense of immunity, it changes people's incentive structure, and if you take away people's sense of immunity, it'll probably change the way they behave. So what I think you ideally want with a good law, thinking like an economist, not a lawyer, is you don't want people to commit frauds. So and again, we're speaking specifically about fraud, and fraud is not protected speech. So you want to encourage people to think they can't get away with committing frauds, and if they think they won't get away with it, then they won't commit them. So they say that the best laws are laws that are easy to enforce, that are quick to enforce, where the penalties are not too onerous, but onerous enough to deter the behavior. Because what we want to do is, we don't want to punish people. We want to avoid punishing people by having people have incentives not to break laws. So that's the incentive structure that we want to get, is we want to discourage the behavior rather than punish the behavior. So, after the fact.
Well
So
said.
um, so that's why I really like your book very much. And because this is the topic that, why is there so little conversation on this topic of frauds against the public? And the point that you make is that the law adequately deals with, if there's a one-to-one relationship, that the law is pretty decent in that. But if it's one to many, that the law is very deficient in that.
Well, I think that your question is, why isn't there more people talking about this, or why doesn't the law deal with it adequately? I can tell you there's a very big pushback against the very idea of holding accountable people for anything called fraud on the public. I don't think anybody that read my book would have any pushback against it, but just the idea of it brings to mind people saying, well, you want to regulate misinformation and disinformation and fake news, and we've seen that. We've seen what comes of that. It's just policing language, and everyone loves their own misinformation and hates the other side's misinformation. And so it's seen as this like political, ideological thing, which, if you've seen the book, so you know that it's not. It's
Right.
not that way at all. I think that there's this loophole that people just aren't aware of. I call it a paradox in the book. It's a paradox where fraud applies to one-on-one. It just doesn't apply to fraud on the public for the most part. Why aren't more people talking about it? I don't think people are aware of it. Everyone is talking about the problem of falsehoods and social media and manipulating public opinion and all that. People are talking about that. They just don't see the fraud paradox in it, the fraud law paradox of what's causing it.
Yes, and I think that, again, the point that you make, and that you've made several times, and I think it's important to continue to reinforce it, is this is not an attack on free speech. This is a matter of speech that the law clearly defines as unprotected speech. So it's not like we're trying to limit free speech. This is all already speech that the law has already established, and there's a lot of jurisprudence about all this. Is the fact is that this is unprotected speech. So, and it has been unprotected speech throughout the history of the country. So this was speech that from a public meaning, constitutional construction, was never intended to be protected speech. Fraud was never protected speech. So we're not talking about limiting speech. We're talking about doing a better job at penalizing speech that's not protected speech, that seems to has been granted a de facto immunity, and so so how can we remove this de facto immunity of speech that clearly is not protected speech, which fraudulent speech is not, and you propose, some potential remedies for that. Um, is that a fair statement I'm making?
It's a very fair statement. That's exactly what I lay on the book. The book really of In Fraud We Trust, at its core, it is a defense of free speech and upholding free speech principles. That's what it's about. Because what's happening now is we have a problem in society. It goes by different names: misinformation, disinformation, fake news, social media issues. But there's a problem, and people are addressing it in different ways. You have, from the right, you have laws coming in from these states saying we need to regulate social media. From the left, we say we need to regulate misinformation or what have you. So there's a problem. It's going to be dealt with. There are solutions that are going to be found and implemented in some way, shape, or form. Those solutions are either going to be an attack on free speech, or they're going to be consistent with the First Amendment and free speech. What I'm putting forward is an approach that upholds our free speech principles, that upholds the First Amendment, and that limits our regulation of false speech to be limited to what would be considered fraud anyway, that really qualifies as fraud. And if we're regulating fraud, then we're well within the First Amendment jurisprudence that we've already had up to today, and upholds the free speech principles for the very purposes for which we're protecting free speech in the first place, which is to allow people to search for truth. So speech is supposed to lead to truth at the end of the day if we're leaving open the marketplace of ideas. Well, fraudulent speech doesn't help in the search for truth. Fraudulent speech hinders the search for truth. Self-governance, free speech principles are supposed to help us know what we're voting on and know who we're voting for. Well, fraudulent speech disrupts that. And so really, by attacking fraudulent speech, it's enforcing and upholding free speech rather than attacking it.
I agree with it. Just like in commerce, upholding fraud laws enables commerce. And in the absence of being able to uphold fraudulent transactions, we'd get a lot less commerce, and we'd be worse off as a society. So that this is what gives people the ability to deal with people we don't know, is that we all know, we sign a contract, we each rely upon each other's statements, and we each know that if we discover that we can't rely upon other people's statements that they making through reps and warranties, that there are adverse consequences associated with it, and parties are usually very careful about the representations and warranties they make, precisely because they know if they make false representations and warranties, there's an extreme consequence associated with it. So that enables free enterprise and enables people to freely engage in transaction with each other, because because it facilitates the establishment of trust, and trust is the framework for all of this. So I think that you said that very, very well, that we want to facilitate trust in society, and fraudulent speech, fraudulent conduct takes away from that, detracts from that. It doesn't contribute to it. And so, but people are entitled to their own ignorance and their own stupidity, and make statements whatever they make, because they're not intending to defraud people. Usually the only people they're defrauding is themselves. So whatever they're doing, they're not attempting to really cause harm to a third party by the statements they're making. They're saying things that they believe. They believe them for whatever reason they believe. They like to defend what their beliefs are, and most of these people make them not because they have any sort of material gain from their personal beliefs. They believe that whatever they believe will make their lives better off and might make everybody else better off, and there's no malice in their beliefs. So so if they believe, whether the border should be open or whether we should have a wall should be closed, these are people who have sincere beliefs, and the beliefs don't have to be predicated upon having any sort of extensive due diligence in the process. It could be anecdotal, and those anecdotals are meaningful to them, and so they choose to believe it, and they don't want to cause anybody harm through their beliefs, and they don't want to have any sort of profit by misrepresenting their belief to a party. So that's very different, and I think that's very, very important. We got to keep reinforcing this is not about an attack on misinformation or disinformation or all the other things pilots talk about. We want to encourage people to speak and speak freely. We just don't want to encourage people to commit a fraud, and people should be there should be unanimity on the fact is that nobody should want to be a victim of fraud. So the standard for proving fraud is a pretty high standard.
Exactly. Very well said. I don't think I could have said it better myself. It comes down to stopping fraud, which has its own elements, and if those are met, then we shouldn't be protecting that kind of speech. We shouldn't be letting people commit fraud.
Well, Wes, I always like to give my guest the last unfiltered words, because I talk a lot, and I hope that you feel like my contribution to the conversation has been constructive. But I hope I haven't stopped you from saying things that you would have liked to have had the opportunity to say. So now's your chance that for you to say the things that maybe questions I should have asked that I didn't ask, that you would like to talk about, other things you'd like to talk about with respect to the book, other things you didn't get a chance to talk about, and how other people become more aware of the work that you're doing. So go ahead. This is your time, and use as much of it as you would like to say whatever you'd like to say to close out this conversation.
All right. Well, as my own students often say, I'm a man of few words. I'm not someone who goes off on soliloquies, so I'm probably going to keep this short. I think that this whole discussion centering on fraud, in whether it's in the political realm or corporate realm or social media, of course, there's no substitute for us individually to take it upon ourselves to discern what we believe to be true and false, and to question what we think is true or false, because you can find often that you're wrong, as I have, at least up to this point in life. Sometimes you think you're certain on something, but you change your mind later. Be self-critical, be critical of the information you receive, and there's no substitute, I suppose, for making up your own mind. And this whole issue of false speech isn't something that either side of the political aisle has any monopoly on. It's something that happens across the board. It's not ideological. And so no one's really immune to it. So whoever might think everyone always thinks the other side lies more. Well, you should not be so confident in such a belief, because lies are kind of all over the place. And so you got to determine for yourself what you believe to be true or false, and look out for fraud. As far as where to find my work, the only thing really I think of public interest is the book, In Fraud We Trust. Other than Jeffrey, not many people out there reading my academic articles, although they can be found publicly as well. But I think my book kind of encapsulates what I have to say on this. So that I think is going to take care of it.
Well, thank you very much, Wes. It was very nice to have this conversation with you, and very nice to meet you. And I really enjoyed your book, and I got a lot out of reading it. So thank you very much.
Likewise, Jeffrey, thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful for you taking the time to have this conversation.
Well, have a great day, Wes.
All right, thank you. You too.
Bye.